The day I paid off my cafe, every sleepless night finally behind me, my brother walked in with our parents and demanded half of it. It belongs to the family, they said. Funny. When I was scrubbing floors at 4 in the morning, the family was still asleep. My name is Nora Whitaker, 24 years old, owner of Riverside Brew Café in Portland. I'm the kind of woman who measures time in espresso shots and invoice deadlines. Calm on the outside, caffeine on the inside. I built this place from nothing but tips, second-hand equipment, and a stubborn belief that warmth could be poured into a cup. That afternoon, sunlight spilled through the window, catching the steam above the machine like gold dust. I had just finished the last payment, every cent of debt finally gone. I was holding the receipt when the doorbell chimed. My brother Mark strolled in first, followed by Mom and Dad. Their smiles looked rehearsed. Mom brushed her fingers along the counter. "You've done well, sweetheart," she said softly, glancing at Dad. "And now that the cafe's stable, we think it's time to make things official." Mark leaned against the register. 50-50 split, he said, like it was obvious. "I've been helping since day one." I stared at him, trying to remember any morning he'd been here before sunrise, any night he'd wiped down tables after closing. Nothing. Dad cleared his throat. "Family sticks together. Nora, you wouldn't have made it without us." My chest felt tight, the air heavy with roasted beans and betrayal. I folded the payment receipt in half, pressed it flat on the counter, and met their eyes. "I made it," I said quietly, because no one else showed up. That was the moment everything I thought I knew about family began to unravel. Before the cafe, before the name Riverside Brew ever touched a paper cup, there was just me balancing 2 jobs, smelling like burnt fries and detergent, saving every dollar I could fit inside a chipped glass jar. I'd written 1 word on it in permanent marker Riverside. It wasn't a place yet, just a promise. Back then, I lived in a narrow basement apartment that always smelled faintly of bleach and hope. On nights when the restaurant closed late, I'd grind beans at my tiny kitchen counter, trying to teach myself how to taste notes beyond bitter. My hands were raw from washing dishes, but I loved the rhythm, the hiss of the kettle, the bloom of steam. It made me feel like I was creating something that might one day last. Dad didn't understand. Frank Whitaker was a construction man, all bricks and steel, the kind of person who trusted things only if they could hold weight. "Coffee won't build you a future, Nora," he'd say, shaking his head as he looked over my sketches of counters and floor plans. "You can't live off foam." Mom, Evelyn, never argued with him. She'd fold her napkin neatly and say, "Your father's just worried. You know how people talk when things fail." Her words were soft, but they always left a bruise. Mark was worse, 3 years older, running his repair shop out on Powell Boulevard. He'd laugh every time I mentioned business plans. "So, you're gonna sell caffeine to hipsters and call it a career? Let me know when you want a real job." I didn't answer. I just kept saving. Took a part-time barista course at the community college, learned about milk textures, extraction times, roasting temperatures. Every paycheck went into equipment used, scratched. But mine. The day I finally signed the lease for a 300-square-foot space near the river. My hands trembled so hard I almost dropped the pen. It smelled of dust and potential. Empty walls, uneven floor, a single flickering light bulb. Still. I could already hear it, the quiet hum of a dream beginning to brew. The first week of Riverside Brew felt like trying to breathe through fog. My hands shook so much I spilled milk across the counter twice before the first customer even paid. The espresso shots ran too fast, too thin. The milk frothed into something closer to dish soap than foam. By noon, I'd sold maybe a dozen drinks, $50 in the register less after I counted the cost of beans and milk. That night, I sat on the floor, surrounded by empty cups and exhaustion, the cafe smelling like scorched milk and cleaning spray. I should have felt defeated. Instead, I scribbled notes in a stained notebook: ratios, grind settings, milk temperature. Tomorrow, I told myself. I'd get one thing right. Just one. On day 3, the grinder jammed. The repairman quoted $300, more than my weekly sales. I watched him leave, then took the machine apart myself with a borrowed wrench and a YouTube tutorial. It took 4 hours, 3 blisters, and one desperate prayer. But when the motor finally hummed back to life, I laughed until my throat ached. Little by little, small miracles appeared. A food blogger named Lena Chow wandered in one rainy afternoon and ordered a cinnamon latte. She posted a picture that evening, tiny Portland Café with heart in every cup. By morning, a handful of new faces appeared, curious and kind. Next came the bakery across the street. Haven Bread, run by a quiet couple, Jordan and Elise. They started dropping off pastries for me to sell croissants still warm from their oven. I'd send them free coffee in return. We weren't competitors, we were survivors finding each other. The register stayed modest, but the rhythm grew steady grind, tamp, pour, wipe, repeat. The smell of fresh roast began to sink into my skin like a new kind of armor. One evening, as I locked up, Mark's car slowed in front of the shop. He rolled down his window, grinning. Cute hobby. Nora. Then he drove off, leaving exhaust in the air. I turned the sign to closed and stood there a moment, listening to the hum of the fridge, the faint drip from the espresso machine. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was mine. 2 years passed before I realized how different the mornings felt. The air outside still smelled of rain and river mist, but inside Riverside Brew, the scent had changed richer, layered with cinnamon, espresso, and the faint sweetness of success. By 6 a.m., a small line always curled past the door nurses grabbing lattes before their shifts, students clutching laptops, an old man named Henry who ordered the same black coffee every day and always left $2 in the tip jar for luck. I added plants to the windowsill, soft music to the speakers, and a community board where regulars pinned small notes, lost pets, poetry readings, part-time jobs. The cafe had become what I'd always imagined a place that breathed with people. The loan that had once kept me awake at night was finally gone. When I handed the final payment to the bank teller, my hands trembled the same way they had when I first signed the lease. Only this time, the fear was gone. I'd done it. That's when Mark started showing up again. At first, it seemed harmless he'd stop by on Saturdays, offer to carry the heavy bags of beans from the back room. I thanked him, though he never stayed long enough to break a sweat. Then the visits became longer. He started chatting with customers, sliding behind the counter when I was busy, greeting people with an easy grin. "Our cafe's doing great," he'd tell them. "We've come a long way." I'd laugh it off at first, assuming it was just his way of feeling involved. But each time he said our cafe, something sharp twisted inside me. One afternoon, Mom dropped by for the first time in months. She looked around approvingly, tracing the polished tables with her hand. "It's lovely, Nora," she said, "and it's good that Mark's been helping. Don't forget who supported you." Before I could answer, Dad's voice echoed through the phone she held up on speaker. "Family should share in success," he said. "That's how it works." Their words hung in the air like the aftertaste of burnt coffee, familiar, bitter, and hard to swallow. For the first time since opening, the scent of my own cafe made me uneasy. Mom called it a family dinner, her voice warm in that practiced way that always meant something was coming. I went because saying no would only feed the gossip chain that already followed me through our small Portland neighborhood. When I arrived, the table was set too perfectly: candles, linen napkins, my father's favorite roast chicken. Even Mark was there, wearing a collared shirt he only dusted off for special occasions. At first, it felt almost normal. Mom asked about the cafe. Dad grunted approvingly when I mentioned the new espresso machine, and Mark poured himself more wine than anyone else. For a few fleeting minutes, I let myself believe maybe they were proud. Then Mom set down her fork and folded her hands. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice suddenly softer. "We need to talk about something important." I felt my shoulders tighten. "Mark's been helping you build that place for a while now," she continued. And your father and I think it's time he gets official recognition. 50-50, that's fair. Dad nodded, not even looking at me, as if the matter were already settled. The words hit harder than I expected. 50-50 for carrying beans twice a week, for standing behind the counter smiling at customers he didn't even know. My mouth went dry. I appreciate his help. I managed, but the cafe is mine. I started it, paid for it, worked every mom's expression sharpened. Don't be ungrateful. Family helps family. Dad's tone dropped heavy and final. You wouldn't have made it without us. Mark leaned back, smirking like someone watching their plan unfold. It's fine, he said, swirling his wine. I'll keep helping until she realizes how much she needs me. I excused myself early, claiming an early morning shift. The moment my apartment door closed, I fell apart, tears spilling faster than I could stop them. When the sobs finally quieted, I opened my laptop. The numbers on my QuickBooks screen stared back at me. Sales, expenses, deposits. Something inside me shifted. The intuition I'd learned to trust behind a coffee bar whispered again, steady, certain. Something was off. At first, it was small enough to ignore a missing 20 here, a wrong change there. I blamed long days and short sleep, convinced I'd simply miscounted. But the gaps kept showing up, neat little round numbers that didn't look like mistakes. Every time Mark handled the register, the totals came up short. It wasn't obvious enough to accuse him. Not yet. Just consistent, predictable, like a drip from a leaky faucet you can't unhear once you notice it. One night after closing, I sat at the counter surrounded by receipts, eyes burning under the yellow light. The patterns were clear, the shortfalls always lined up with his shifts. I rechecked every transaction, feeling the same cold nausea I'd had when my bank account once hit zero. The next morning, I installed a new digital register system that tracked each sale, each drawer opening, each staff login. Mark raised an eyebrow. Getting fancy? Huh, he joked, but his smile looked thinner than usual. Then I added cameras, just 2, tucked above the counter and the back storage room. The cafe had never felt so quiet, like it was holding its breath. The evidence brewed slowly, dark and steady. Week by week. The same thing happened, money missing only when he worked. My friend Diana, a part-time accountant who came by for oat lattes, helped me comb through the data. You're not crazy, she said, tapping the spreadsheet. Someone's skimming. The numbers don't lie. I nodded, though it didn't feel like relief. It felt like grief because the only person it could be was the one who called himself family. That weekend, I met Miguel, the roaster who supplied my beans, at his warehouse. He handed me a cup of his new blend and studied my face. You look like your shot's pulling bitter, he said gently. I tried to smile. Family drama, I muttered. He shrugged, thoughtful. Pressure brings clarity, just like espresso. Keep the heat steady, and the truth will rise. At home that night, I opened my ledger again, heart pounding in the stillness. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows, the steady rhythm of Portland nights. Inside, something darker was taking shape, slow, undeniable, and ready to boil over. The numbers didn't lie anymore. Diana's spreadsheets showed a pattern too precise to be coincidence, deposits into Mark's personal account that mirrored my missing cash almost to the dollar. The realization sat in my stomach like bad coffee. I had hoped I was wrong, that exhaustion was making me paranoid. But the proof was there, black and white, cruel and clear. When I confronted him, it was a quiet Thursday afternoon. The cafe was empty except for the hum of the fridge. I know about the money, I said, keeping my voice steady. You've been taking from the register. Mark blinked, then smirked like I'd just told a joke. You're accusing your own brother. I'm working for free half the time. Maybe you should thank me. You've been stealing, I repeated. His tone turned sharp. You really are ungrateful. Everything you have came from this family. Without me, you'd still be broke and alone. You want to burn that bridge? Go ahead. But if you don't make me a partner, I'll make this messy. You won't like what happens when Mom and Dad find out what you've done." He walked out before I could answer, leaving the door swinging behind him. The smell of espresso clung to the air, sour and burnt. That night, I drove to my parents' house, desperate for reason. Mom folded her arms before I even finished explaining. "Mark wouldn't do that," she said coldly. "He's family," Dad muttered. "You always exaggerate. Nora, you've changed." By the time I got home, their words were still echoing in my head. I sat in the dark cafe, the machines off, the room too still. The tears came and went without sound. Then I poured myself a cup of cold coffee, stared at the sign above the door, and whispered, "If I built this from nothing, I can protect it from anyone." The next morning, I called Lydia Kent, a small business attorney recommended by Diana. By the end of the week, Riverside Brew LLC existed mine alone, signed and sealed. The lawsuit arrived folded in a neat white envelope, stamped with my brother's name. Petition for partnership recognition. I read it 3 times before the meaning settled in. Mark was suing me for half of Riverside Brew. By the time the court date came, the story had already spread through our neighborhood. My parents walked around like local celebrities, telling anyone who would listen that justice was finally coming for their ungrateful daughter. Mark bragged to his friends that he'd soon officially own half the place. They all believed it. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, the kind of sterile air that promises fairness but delivers fear. I sat beside Lydia Kent, my attorney, her calm presence the only solid ground I had left. Across the aisle, Mark adjusted his tie, smirking as though he'd already won. Mom and Dad sat behind him, heads high, their pride like armor. When the judge called the case, Mark's lawyer stood and began his performance. "My client," he said smoothly, "has contributed significant labor and support to this business. This case is simply about fairness recognizing an informal partnership that has existed for years." He gestured toward Mark, who nodded solemnly, playing the victim. Then Lydia stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She opened a folder and began laying out the evidence, each piece like a measured pour of truth. "Payroll records," she said, sliding the first document across the table, showing that Mr. Whitaker was paid hourly for every shift he worked. Click, she switched to a monitor. Footage appeared, Mark, behind my counter, pocketing cash when he thought no one was watching. Next came the bank statements deposits matching the missing cash almost to the dollar. Then, the final blow, an audio clip recorded during one of his conversations at my parents' house. "Once my name's on paper," Mark's voice said, smug and certain. "She's out." The silence afterward was deafening. The judge leaned forward, expression cold. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "this isn't partnership. This is theft." The ruling came swift and clean. Mark was ordered to repay every stolen dollar, plus penalties, and was legally barred from entering Riverside Brew again. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Dad's shoulders slumped, the reality cracking through decades of certainty. Mark didn't look at me as the bailiff guided him out. I didn't smile. I just exhaled the first breath that felt like mine in years. The aroma of the courtroom wasn't coffee, but it carried the same bittersweet heat of something roasted to perfection. They came on a Sunday afternoon, the same day of the week they used to call Family Day. I saw their car pull up through the cafe window. My mother's hands clasped in her lap. My father's jaw set like he was walking into a job that needed doing. I almost pretended not to notice. But old habits die hard. I opened the door before they could knock. Mom's eyes swept the room, the plants, the counter, the familiar smell of coffee. "It looks nice," she said softly, then hesitated. "Nora, maybe it's time to let this go. Drop the charges. Mark's been through enough." Dad nodded, not quite meeting my gaze. "He's family. We can fix this if you stop now. You don't want to be the reason your brother's life gets ruined." Their words sounded careful, chosen, as if they'd rehearsed them in the car, but underneath, I heard what they really meant. Restore the picture of a family that never truly existed. I stood behind the counter, my hands steady on the edge. "You're still a family," I said quietly. "Just not mine." Mom's face fell. "You don't mean that." "I do," I answered. "I spent years trying to earn a seat at your table. I've built my own now." Dad opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence between us was thick and final. After a moment, he placed his car keys in his pocket and guided Mom toward the door. Neither of them looked back. When their car disappeared around the corner, I turned the lock and flipped the open sign to closed. The cafe hummed with the faint rhythm of machines cooling, the smell of roasted beans wrapping around me like a quiet shield. I measured out a handful of coffee and began to grind, the steady whir filling the space where voices used to echo. For the first time in years, the silence didn't ache. It breathed. 3 years later, the mornings at Riverside Brew still begin before the sun. I unlock the door at 5:30, the key turning smooth from years of use, and the smell of roasted beans rises to meet me like an old friend. The cafe is no longer small. We expanded into the space next door, added a second location across the river, and built something steady enough to hold more than my own dream. Now there are 5 employees, 3 of them young baristas I mentor through a paid internship program. I teach them the same way I taught myself through mistakes, through burns, through the slow patience of a pour-over done right. Sometimes I catch them laughing behind the counter, and it fills the room with a kind of joy that money can't buy. A local newspaper ran a story last month, "The Woman Who Built from the Ground Up." They took a picture of me in front of the cafe, holding a mug with my name etched on it. For a while, people stopped me on the street to congratulate me. I smiled, but what mattered most wasn't the article. It was the quiet proof that I'd done everything they said I couldn't. Every so often, when the traffic slows on Burnside Street, I see a familiar car pause outside the window. My parents sit inside, faces half hidden, watching the place they once called a hobby. They never come in. They don't have to. At dawn, when the world is still asleep, I stand by the roaster, listening to the crack of the beans, the rhythm that once kept me alive. The air fills with warmth and smoke and memory. I whisper to no one in particular. They tried to steal my dream. Instead, they taught me ownership. The first sip of the day tastes like peace.